Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she ladled another serving of mashed potatoes onto a soldier's tray. The mess hall was packed with hungry troops and the lunch rush was in full swing. She had been working in the kitchen for 3 months now, ever since she started her civilian job at Fort Braxton. Most days blended together in a routine of prep work, serving, and cleanup. She kept her head down, did her job well, and tried not to draw attention to herself. The cafeteria buzzed with conversation and the clatter of trays. Soldiers joked with each other, complained about training exercises, and discussed weekend plans. Sarah moved efficiently along the serving line, her movements practiced and smooth. She had served thousands of meals since starting here, and she could do it with her eyes closed. Today felt different, though. There was tension in the air that she couldn't quite place. Several officers had been walking through the mess hall more frequently than usual, observing the operations. Sarah had heard whispers about budget cuts and staff evaluations. Her supervisor, Mrs. Patterson, had been more stressed than normal, constantly checking and rechecking everything. As Sarah reached for another ladle, her sleeve rode up slightly, revealing just a small portion of the tattoo on her forearm. She quickly pulled her sleeve back down, a habit she had developed over the years. The tattoo was something from her past that she preferred to keep hidden. It represented a life she had left behind, a chapter she had closed. Colonel James Harrison entered the mess hall with his usual commanding presence. He was known throughout the base as a fair but tough leader who had served multiple tours overseas. His sharp eyes missed nothing, and he had a reputation for remembering details that others overlooked. Today, he was conducting one of his regular inspections of base facilities. The colonel moved through the dining area, stopping to chat with soldiers and observe the operations. He prided himself on knowing what was happening in every corner of his base. As he approached the serving line, Sarah felt a familiar knot in her stomach. Authority figures always made her nervous, even though she had nothing to hide in her current job. "How's the food today, Martinez?" Colonel Harrison asked, reading her name tag as he approached her station. "Good, sir. Fresh batch of everything this morning," Sarah replied, keeping her eyes focused on the food she was serving. The colonel nodded and was about to move on when something caught his eye. As Sarah reached across the counter to help serve a soldier with a full tray, her sleeve pulled back again. This time, Colonel Harrison saw it clearly. The distinctive tattoo on her forearm made him stop in his tracks. It was the emblem of the 75th Ranger Regiment, specifically the design used by a special operations unit that had been disbanded several years ago. Colonel Harrison knew that tattoo well because he had served alongside many soldiers who bore the same mark. But what puzzled him was seeing it on a civilian cafeteria worker, and a woman at that. Sarah noticed the colonel staring and quickly adjusted her sleeve again, but it was too late. She could see the recognition in his eyes, followed by confusion and curiosity. Her heart rate picked up, and she tried to focus on the next soldier in line, hoping the colonel would simply move on. But Colonel Harrison didn't move on. He stood there for a moment longer, studying Sarah's face as if trying to place her. There was something familiar about her features, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. The tattoo, however, was unmistakable. He had seen enough of them to know the real thing when he saw it. "That's an interesting tattoo," the colonel said quietly, his voice carrying just enough authority to make it clear this wasn't casual conversation. Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she continued serving. "Thank you, sir," she managed to say, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "Where did you get it?" Colonel Harrison asked, his tone becoming more direct. Sarah felt the walls closing in around her. She had hoped to avoid this conversation for as long as possible. The tattoo was a reminder of a time when she was a different person, when she had responsibilities and capabilities that seemed like a lifetime ago. Now she was just Sarah Martinez, the woman who served lunch in the mess hall. "It's from a long time ago, sir," she said, trying to end the conversation without being disrespectful. Colonel Harrison sensed there was much more to this story. In his experience, people didn't just randomly get military tattoos, especially not ones as specific as the 75th Ranger Regiment emblem. There were strict protocols about who could earn such markings, and they weren't handed out lightly. The lunch line continued to move, but the colonel remained in place, clearly not satisfied with Sarah's vague answer. Other soldiers began to notice the unusual interaction, and Sarah could feel their curious glances. She hated being the center of attention, especially when it involved questions about her past. "Ma'am, I think we need to have a conversation," Colonel Harrison said, his voice low but firm. "When do you get off work today?" Sarah's mouth went dry. She had known this day might come eventually, but she had hoped to delay it indefinitely. The tattoo was like a permanent reminder of who she used to be, and now it threatened to expose everything she had worked to leave behind. "I finish at 3, sir," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Report to my office at 3:15, the colonel instructed. "Building C, 2nd floor." As Colonel Harrison walked away, Sarah felt her carefully constructed new life beginning to unravel. The other kitchen workers had noticed the interaction, and she could see them whispering among themselves. Mrs. Patterson approached her with concern written across her face. "Everything okay, Sarah?" her supervisor asked. Sarah nodded, but inside she was anything but okay. For 3 months she had successfully hidden in plain sight, just another civilian employee going about her daily routine. Now, because of a tattoo she couldn't remove and a sleeve that had ridden up at the wrong moment, everything was about to change. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. Sarah went through the motions of cleaning up and preparing for the next meal service, but her mind was elsewhere. She kept replaying the look in Colonel Harrison's eyes when he saw her tattoo. It was the look of someone who knew exactly what that marking meant and was determined to find out how she had earned it. Sarah stood outside Building C, staring at the imposing structure that housed the base's administrative offices. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she kept checking her watch. It was 3:10 p.m., and she knew she needed to go inside, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. Taking a deep breath, she forced herself to walk through the entrance and climb the stairs to the 2nd floor. The hallway was lined with offices belonging to various high-ranking officers. Sarah had never been in this part of the base before. Her world had been limited to the kitchen, the storage areas, and the employee break room. Now she found herself in the heart of the base's command structure, where decisions were made that affected thousands of soldiers. Colonel Harrison's office was easy to find. His name was clearly displayed on a placard next to the door, along with his various commendations and ranks. Sarah knocked softly, hoping against hope that maybe he had forgotten about their appointment or been called away on urgent business. "Come in," came the colonel's voice from inside. Sarah opened the door and stepped into an office that reflected its occupant's military precision. Everything was perfectly organized, from the files on his desk to the awards and photographs lining the walls. Colonel Harrison was seated behind his desk, reviewing what appeared to be personnel files. He looked up when she entered and gestured to the chair across from him. "Please, have a seat, Ms. Martinez," he said, his tone professional, but not unkind. Sarah sat down, keeping her posture straight and her hands folded in her lap. She had learned long ago that confidence and composure could sometimes carry you through difficult situations, even when you felt anything but confident inside. Colonel Harrison studied her for a moment before speaking. "I've been doing some research since our conversation in the mess hall," he began. "That tattoo you have isn't something you can just walk into any shop and get. The 75th Ranger Regiment emblem, specifically the version you're wearing, was only given to members of a very elite unit." Sarah remained silent, unsure of how much the colonel already knew and how much she should reveal. She had spent years learning to compartmentalize her past, to lock away the memories and experiences that had once defined her entire existence. The unit that used that particular design was disbanded in 2018, Colonel Harrison continued. Most of its members were reassigned to other special operations groups. Some retired. Some. He paused, watching Sarah's reaction carefully. Some just disappeared from the system entirely. The silence in the room was heavy. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat and the distant sounds of base activity outside the window. She knew the colonel was waiting for her to fill in the blanks, but she wasn't sure she was ready to open that door. "Sir, with respect, I'm not sure why this matters," Sarah finally said. "I'm just a civilian employee now. I serve food and clean up after myself. I haven't caused any problems or security issues." Colonel Harrison leaned back in his chair. "You're right. You haven't caused any problems. In fact, your supervisor speaks very highly of your work. But I have a responsibility to know who's on my base especially when they have backgrounds that might be relevant to our security and operations. He opened a folder on his desk and pulled out what appeared to be a personnel file. "I've been making some calls," he said. "It's interesting how little information is available about certain former members of that unit, almost as if their records were deliberately obscured or classified." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had hoped that enough time had passed and enough bureaucratic changes had occurred that her old life would remain buried. But Colonel Harrison was clearly more resourceful and persistent than she had anticipated. "I'm going to ask you directly," the colonel said, leaning forward. "Were you a member of the 75th Ranger Regiment?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah knew she could continue to deflect and avoid, but something in the colonel's manner suggested that he already suspected the truth. More importantly, she was tired of running from who she used to be. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. Colonel Harrison nodded as if this confirmation was exactly what he had expected. "What was your rank and specialization?" "Staff Sergeant. Intelligence and Reconnaissance," Sarah replied, her voice growing stronger as she spoke the words she hadn't said aloud in years. "How long did you serve?" 8 years active duty, 3 deployments overseas." The colonel made notes in the file as she spoke. "And why did you leave?" This was the question Sarah had been dreading. The answer involved pain and loss and decisions that had changed the entire trajectory of her life. She took a moment to compose herself before responding. "My unit was involved in an operation that went wrong," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We lost people, good people. I was injured and spent 6 months in recovery. When I was cleared for duty, I just couldn't do it anymore." Colonel Harrison's expression softened slightly. He had seen enough combat and loss to understand the weight of what Sarah was describing. "What kind of injury?" Sarah hesitated, then rolled up her sleeve to reveal not just the tattoo, but also a network of scars that told the story of shrapnel wounds and multiple surgeries. "IED explosion," she said simply. "I was lucky to keep my arm." The colonel studied the scars with the practiced eye of someone who had seen similar wounds before. "That must have been a difficult recovery," he said. "The physical part was manageable," Sarah replied. "It was everything else that was harder." Colonel Harrison closed the file and leaned back in his chair again. "So you left the military and ended up here, serving food in a mess hall. That's quite a change." Sarah nodded. "I needed something simple. Something where I didn't have to make life or death decisions or watch my back constantly. The kitchen work is honest and it keeps me busy." "But you're wasting your skills," the colonel said. "Your training, your experience, your capabilities. You're one of the most qualified people on this entire base and you're ladling mashed potatoes." "Maybe that's all I want to do now," Sarah replied, though even as she said it, she wasn't entirely sure it was true. Colonel Harrison stood up and walked to the window overlooking the training grounds. "I understand the desire to step away from the intensity of special operations," he said, "but I also understand the military's need for experienced personnel, especially in intelligence and reconnaissance." Sarah felt her stomach drop. "Sir, if you're thinking about recommending me for reactivation, I need to tell you that I'm not interested. I've built a quiet life here and I'd like to keep it that way." The colonel turned back to face her. "I'm not talking about reactivation, Sergeant Martinez. I'm talking about a consulting position. Civilian status, but utilizing your expertise in areas where we need help." "What kind of areas?" Sarah asked, despite herself. "We've been having security issues. Small things, but they're adding up. Missing supplies, unauthorized access to certain areas, information leaks. I could use someone with your background to help assess our vulnerabilities and recommend improvements." Sarah considered his proposal. Part of her was intrigued by the challenge, but another part was terrified of being pulled back into a world she had worked so hard to leave behind. "I need time to think about it," she said finally. Colonel Harrison nodded. "Take all the time you need. But Sarah," he said, using her first name for the first time, "don't underestimate your own value. You have skills and knowledge that could make a real difference here." As Sarah left the office, her mind was racing with possibilities and concerns. Her carefully ordered life had just been turned upside down, and she wasn't sure whether to be excited or terrified about what might come next. Sarah barely slept that night. She lay in her small apartment off base, staring at the ceiling and replaying her conversation with Colonel Harrison over and over in her mind. The ceiling fan creaked rhythmically above her, a sound that usually helped her sleep, but tonight only seemed to emphasize how restless she felt. She had built her entire new life around simplicity and routine. Her apartment was sparse but comfortable, with just the essentials and a few personal items that didn't remind her of her military days. She had a schedule that never varied much, coworkers who knew her only as the quiet woman who did her job well, and a paycheck that covered her modest needs. It wasn't exciting, but it was safe. Now Colonel Harrison was offering her something that could change everything. The thought of using her old skills again was both thrilling and terrifying. She had spent years trying to forget the rush of adrenaline that came with high-stakes operations. The satisfaction of solving complex problems, and the sense of purpose that had once driven her every decision. The next morning, Sarah went through her usual routine of preparing breakfast and getting ready for work. But everything felt different. She found herself analyzing the security of her own apartment building, noticing things she had trained herself to ignore. The broken lock on the mailbox area, the blind spot near the parking garage entrance, the fact that anyone could follow residents through the main door without being challenged. At work, she moved through the morning prep with mechanical efficiency, but her mind was elsewhere. Mrs. Patterson noticed her distraction and asked if everything was okay after her meeting with the colonel the day before. "Just some paperwork issues," Sarah said, not wanting to explain the real situation. During her lunch break, Sarah decided to take a walk around the base instead of eating in the employee break room as she usually did. She hadn't really explored Fort Braxton beyond the kitchen and dining areas since starting work there. Now, with Colonel Harrison's proposal on her mind, she found herself seeing the base through different eyes. She noticed the patrol patterns of the security guards, the locations of surveillance cameras, and the way different areas of the base were secured. Her old training kicked in automatically, and she began mentally cataloging potential vulnerabilities and security gaps. It was like flexing muscles she hadn't used in years. Near the motor pool, she observed soldiers loading equipment onto trucks. The operation looked routine, but Sarah noticed that the manifest checking seemed careless, and the soldiers were more focused on their conversation than on security protocols. Anyone with basic knowledge could potentially walk away with valuable equipment if they timed it right. By the administrative buildings, she saw that visitor badges were being issued without proper identification verification. The young soldier manning the security desk was clearly overwhelmed and cutting corners to keep the line moving. Sarah made mental notes of each issue she observed, almost without realizing she was doing it. That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment with a notepad and found herself writing down everything she had noticed during her walk. The list grew longer than she had expected, and she realized that Fort Braxton had more security vulnerabilities than she would have thought possible for an active military installation. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was her sister Maria calling from California. "Hey, stranger," Maria said cheerfully. "Just checking in to see how you're doing." Sarah and Maria talked every few weeks, but her sister knew very little about Sarah's military background. As far as Maria knew, Sarah had served in the Army, but in a support role, nothing dangerous or classified. It was easier that way. "I'm fine," Sarah said, though she didn't feel fine at all. "Just work stuff on my mind." "Still serving food to soldiers?" Maria asked. "You know, I've never understood why you took that job. You're so smart, and you could do so much more." The comment stung more than usual, partly because Colonel Harrison had said something similar the day before. Sarah had always deflected her family's questions about her career choices, but now she was beginning to question them herself. "It's honest work," Sarah replied, the same answer she always gave. "I know, but don't you want something more challenging? Something that uses your brain?" After the call ended, Sarah sat in silence, thinking about her sister's words. The truth was, she did miss the intellectual challenges of her old job. She missed the feeling of making a real difference, of using her skills to solve important problems. But she also remembered the cost of that work, the stress and danger and loss that had eventually broken her. The next day at work, Sarah found herself paying even closer attention to the base's operations. During the lunch rush, she noticed patterns in how the soldiers moved through the dining area, which entrances they used most frequently, and how the flow of people could potentially be disrupted or exploited. She also began observing her co-workers more carefully. Most of them were local civilians like herself, people who needed steady work and didn't ask too many questions. But a few seemed to pay unusual attention to military schedules and procedures. Sarah told herself she was being paranoid, but her instincts were telling her something different. Late in the afternoon, as Sarah was cleaning up her station, she overheard two soldiers talking about equipment that had gone missing from a supply depot. It was the third conversation about missing supplies she had heard in the past week. Individually, each incident might be explained by poor inventory control or simple theft, but together they suggested a pattern. Colonel Harrison appeared at the serving line again, earlier than his usual inspection time. This time Sarah was ready for him. "Have you given any thought to our conversation?" he asked quietly. Sarah glanced around to make sure they couldn't be overheard, then leaned slightly closer. "I've been thinking about it, sir, and I've been observing." "And what have you observed?" "Enough to know that you're right about the security issues," Sarah said. "The problems are bigger than I think you realize." Colonel Harrison's expression sharpened with interest. "Care to elaborate?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, then made her decision. "Not here. Too many ears. But yes, sir, I'm interested in your proposal." The colonel nodded approvingly. "Good. Can you come by my office again tomorrow? Same time?" "Yes, sir." As Colonel Harrison walked away, Sarah felt a familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension. She was about to step back into a world she had worked hard to leave behind, but she was beginning to realize that maybe she had been hiding from her true self rather than healing from her past. That night, Sarah pulled out a box from the back of her closet that she hadn't opened in over 2 years. Inside were commendations, photographs, and other mementos from her military service. Looking at them now, she felt proud rather than pained. Maybe it was time to stop running from who she used to be and start figuring out who she could become. Sarah arrived at Colonel Harrison's office with a folder containing her observations from the past 2 days. She had spent the previous evening organizing her notes and creating a preliminary assessment of the security vulnerabilities she had identified. As she sat across from the colonel, she felt more alert and focused than she had in months. "I've reviewed your service record," Colonel Harrison began, placing a thick file on his desk. "Your commendations are impressive. 3 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart, and recommendations for advancement that were only stopped by your medical leave." Sarah nodded but didn't comment. Awards and recognition felt like they belonged to a different person now. "More importantly," the colonel continued, "your former commanding officers describe you as one of the most intuitive intelligence analysts they ever worked with. They said you could spot patterns and connections that others missed." "That was a long time ago, sir," Sarah said, though she felt a flutter of pride at the recognition. "Maybe not as long as you think," Colonel Harrison replied. "Let's see what you've observed." Sarah opened her folder and began presenting her findings. She had documented security gaps at multiple points around the base, from the visitor registration process to equipment storage protocols. She had also identified patterns in the timing and types of missing supplies that suggested coordinated theft, rather than random incidents. Colonel Harrison listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. As Sarah spoke, she felt her confidence returning. The analysis felt natural, like speaking a language she had almost forgotten but was quickly remembering. "This is excellent work," the colonel said when she finished. "You've identified several issues that our regular security assessments missed, but I'm particularly interested in your theory about the coordinated theft." Sarah had been hesitant to include that section of her report, worried that it might seem too speculative. "The timing patterns are the key," she explained. "The thefts happen on specific days of the week, always during shift changes when supervision is minimal. And the items being taken are small, valuable, and easily resold. Someone with inside knowledge is either doing this themselves or providing information to outside parties. Do you have any suspects in mind?" "I need more information before I can make specific accusations," Sarah said carefully. "But I have some ideas about how to narrow down the possibilities." Colonel Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah's face. "I'm going to be frank with you, Sergeant Martinez. The reason I'm so interested in these thefts is that they might be connected to a larger security concern. We've had indications that someone is gathering intelligence about our operations and passing it to unauthorized parties." Sarah felt a chill of recognition. Intelligence gathering and analysis of enemy networks had been her specialty in the Rangers. What kind of intelligence? Training schedules, deployment preparations, personnel movements. Nothing classified at the highest levels, but enough to give potential adversaries insights into our capabilities and intentions. And you think the thefts are a cover for the real intelligence operation? That's one possibility. Or they could be unrelated crimes of opportunity. That's what I need you to help me determine. Colonel Harrison opened another file and pulled out a series of photographs and documents. I'm going to share some sensitive information with you, based on your security clearance from your previous service. These are surveillance photos from around the base perimeter, unusual communications intercepts, and reports of suspicious activity. Sarah studied the materials with growing interest. The surveillance photos showed individuals who appeared to be conducting reconnaissance of the base's outer security measures. The communications intercepts revealed coded conversations that referenced dates and times that correlated with recent base activities. This is definitely more than random theft, Sarah said. Someone is running a coordinated intelligence operation against this installation. That's my assessment as well. The question is whether it's an external group that has developed sources inside the base, or whether we have a more serious internal security breach. Sarah's mind was already working through the possibilities, analyzing the evidence and developing theories about how such an operation might work. It felt like coming home to a part of herself she had tried to suppress. I'd like to accept your consulting offer, she said, but I'll need access to more information and the authority to investigate without raising suspicions. Colonel Harrison smiled for the first time since she had known him. I was hoping you'd say that. I've already spoken with your supervisor about adjusting your schedule to allow for special projects. As far as anyone else knows, you're helping with administrative tasks for my office. Over the next hour, Colonel Harrison briefed Sarah on the full scope of the security concerns. The situation was more complex than she had initially realized, with potential connections to organized crime groups and possible foreign intelligence services. Sarah felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with high-stakes work. I'll need to maintain my cover in the kitchen for now, Sarah said. It gives me access to information and allows me to observe people without raising suspicions. But I'll also need clearance to access areas of the base that aren't normally part of my job. Done. I'll have temporary credentials prepared for you. What else do you need? Sarah thought for a moment. Access to personnel files for everyone who has had access to the stolen materials. Communication logs for the dates when intelligence might have been gathered. And a secure way to report findings without using normal channels. The personnel files might take a day or two, but I can get you everything else immediately. As their meeting concluded, Sarah felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced in years. Walking back to the kitchen, she began developing a mental plan for her investigation. She would need to be careful not to alert potential suspects while gathering the information necessary to identify the security breach. Back in the kitchen, Sarah resumed her normal duties, but now every interaction carried additional significance. She paid attention to who asked questions about base operations, who seemed unusually interested in schedules and procedures, and who had access to areas where intelligence might be gathered. During the afternoon prep work, she struck up conversations with co-workers she had previously kept at arm's length. Most of them were exactly what they appeared to be, hard-working civilians grateful for steady employment. But a few responses raised red flags in her mind. One co-worker, James, seemed to know an unusual amount about military protocols for someone who had never served. Another, Linda, had made several comments about financial pressures that could potentially make her vulnerable to recruitment by criminal organizations. Sarah also began paying closer attention to the soldiers who came through the dining line. Some of them were clearly curious about the kitchen operations, asking questions about schedules and procedures that went beyond casual interest. As her shift ended, Sarah realized that her old skills hadn't disappeared. They had just been dormant. The ability to read people, to notice inconsistencies and patterns, to think strategically about complex problems, all of it was still there, waiting to be used again. For the first time since leaving the military, Sarah felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The quiet life she had built for herself had served its purpose, giving her time to heal and recover. But now she was ready to be Staff Sergeant Martinez again, even if only a few people would ever know it. 3 weeks into her investigation, Sarah had established a routine that balanced her kitchen duties with her intelligence work. She arrived early each morning to review overnight security reports in Colonel Harrison's office, spent her regular shift observing and gathering information, and stayed late to analyze her findings and plan the next day's activities. The personnel files had revealed several individuals with potential motives or opportunities for involvement in the security breaches. Sarah had created detailed profiles of each suspect, tracking their schedules, access privileges, and financial situations. What she was discovering painted a picture of a sophisticated operation that went far beyond simple theft. James Peterson, the kitchen worker who knew too much about military protocols, had been discharged from the Army 3 years earlier, under circumstances that weren't entirely clear from his file. His financial records showed regular deposits that didn't match his kitchen salary, and he had been seen in areas of the base where he had no legitimate business. Linda Chen, the co-worker with financial problems, had a gambling addiction that had put her deeply in debt. Phone records showed frequent calls to numbers associated with known criminal organizations. Most concerning, she had access to meal delivery schedules that would reveal when certain areas of the base would be minimally supervised. But the most troubling discovery was Corporal Mike Rodriguez, a supply clerk who had been one of the friendly soldiers Sarah had served regularly in the dining line. His access to inventory systems and storage areas made him perfectly positioned to orchestrate the thefts, and surveillance footage showed him in suspicious locations at times that correlated with missing equipment reports. Sarah had also identified patterns in the intelligence gathering that suggested multiple coordinated sources. The timing of reconnaissance activities around the base perimeter matched with internal security vulnerabilities being exploited. Someone was clearly coordinating information from inside and outside sources to create a comprehensive picture of base operations. On a Tuesday morning, Sarah was reviewing communication intercepts when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. One of the coded conversations referenced specific details about an upcoming training exercise that hadn't been announced publicly yet. The information could only have come from someone with access to classified operational planning. She immediately called Colonel Harrison, using the secure phone he had provided for emergencies. "Sir, we have a problem," she said when he answered. "The intelligence leak is more serious than we thought. Someone has access to classified operational information." "How serious?" "Serious enough that external parties know about Exercise Thunderstrike before most of the soldiers who will be participating in it." There was a long pause. "Meet me in my office in 10 minutes. When Sarah arrived, Colonel Harrison was already on the phone with base security. He gestured for her to sit while he finished his conversation. "We're moving to the next phase," he said after hanging up. "I need you to help plan a controlled operation to identify and apprehend the suspects." Sarah felt a familiar mixture of excitement and nervousness. This was the kind of high-stakes operation she had trained for, but it had been years since she had been involved in anything so complex. "What did you have in mind?" she asked. "We're going to feed different pieces of false information to each suspect and see which version shows up in the intercepted communications. It's an old technique, but effective." Sarah nodded. "The barium meal approach. Each suspect gets unique bait, and we track which version gets leaked." "Exactly. I need you to help design the false information packages and figure out how to deliver them naturally without raising suspicions." Over the next several hours, Sarah and Colonel Harrison developed an elaborate plan. They would create fictional training schedules, supply shipments, and personnel movements, each with subtle variations that would identify the source if they were leaked. The challenge was delivering this information to the suspects in ways that seemed natural and credible. For James Peterson, Sarah would casually mention overhearing discussions about special equipment being delivered for a training exercise. For Linda Chen, she would leave a fake meal delivery schedule where Linda could see it, containing information about when certain areas would be empty. For Corporal Rodriguez, Colonel Harrison would arrange for false inventory reports to be processed through his department. The plan required Sarah to become more actively involved in information gathering rather than just observing. She would need to engage suspects directly, ask leading questions, and create opportunities for them to access and potentially steal the bait information. That afternoon, Sarah put the first phase of the plan into action. During lunch prep, she positioned herself near James Peterson and began a conversation about the increased security measures she had noticed around the base. Seems like they're expecting something big, she said casually. I heard there's some kind of special training exercise coming up that requires equipment they don't usually use here. James showed immediate interest, asking follow-up questions that confirmed Sarah's suspicions about his involvement. His questions were too specific and too knowledgeable for someone whose job was limited to kitchen work. Later that day, Sarah arranged to leave a fake document where Linda Chen would find it while cleaning. The document detailed meal, delivery schedules for areas that would supposedly be empty during specific times related to the fictional training exercise. The hardest part was maintaining her normal demeanor while conducting the operation. Sarah had to serve food, chat with soldiers, and go through her regular routine while simultaneously running a complex intelligence operation. It was mentally exhausting, but it also felt incredibly natural, like using muscles she had almost forgotten she had. That evening, Sarah met with Colonel Harrison to review the day's activities and plan the next phase. They had established monitoring protocols to track if and when the false information appeared in external communications. How did it feel? The colonel asked. Being back in operational mode? Sarah considered the question carefully. Intense, she said finally. But right. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm using my brain the way it was meant to be used. Any regrets about leaving kitchen duty behind? Not yet, Sarah replied honestly. Though I'm not sure I'm ready to completely abandon the simple life I built for myself. Colonel Harrison nodded understandingly. This doesn't have to be permanent. But right now we need your skills to protect this base and the soldiers who serve here. The next morning brought the first results of their operation. The communication intercepts showed that information about the fake equipment delivery had already reached external parties. The speed of the leak confirmed that they were dealing with an active and efficient intelligence network. More concerning was the discovery that multiple pieces of false information had been leaked, suggesting that either their suspects were working together or there were additional sources they hadn't identified yet. Sarah spent the morning analyzing the leaked information, looking for patterns that might reveal the communication methods being used. She noticed that the information had been transmitted in segments, with different pieces appearing in different coded conversations over several hours. They're being careful, she reported to Colonel Harrison, breaking up the intelligence into smaller pieces and using multiple channels. This is sophisticated tradecraft, not amateur hour, which suggests professional training or guidance, the colonel replied. We may be dealing with a foreign intelligence operation rather than just criminal activity. This possibility changed everything. If foreign agents were running assets inside the base, the security implications were far more serious than simple theft or information selling. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. That afternoon, she noticed increased activity among her suspects. James Peterson seemed nervous and distracted, making several phone calls during his breaks. Linda Chen was asking unusual questions about base schedules and operations. Most telling, Corporal Rodriguez had requested access to inventory systems outside his normal duties. Sarah realized that their operation had triggered a response from the intelligence network. The suspects were either preparing to increase their activities or planning to shut down and disappear. Either way, time was running out to gather the evidence needed for arrests. During the evening shift, Sarah observed a meeting between James Peterson and Linda Chen in the parking lot after work. They appeared to be having an intense conversation, and Sarah managed to position herself close enough to overhear fragments of their discussion. What she heard confirmed her worst fears about the scope of the operation. They know something's wrong, Linda was saying. We need to warn the others and get out. Not yet, James replied. We're too close to the big score. One more week and we'll have everything they need. Sarah's mind raced as she processed this information. The big score suggested that the intelligence gathering was building toward a specific objective, possibly related to the upcoming exercise Thunderstrike. If foreign agents were planning to exploit information about the training exercise, the implications for national security were enormous. As she walked back to her car, Sarah felt the familiar weight of high-stakes responsibility. She was no longer just investigating petty theft or even routine intelligence gathering. She was potentially the only thing standing between foreign adversaries and critical information about American military capabilities. That night, Sarah sat in her apartment reviewing everything she had learned over the past few weeks. The quiet, simple life she had built seemed like a distant memory. She was fully back in the world of intelligence operations with all the stress and danger that entailed. But she was also alive in a way she hadn't been since leaving the military. The mental challenges, the strategic thinking, the sense of serving something larger than herself, all of it felt like coming home to who she really was. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and probably new dangers. But for the first time in years, Sarah Martinez felt like Staff Sergeant Martinez again, and she was ready for whatever came next. The next morning, Sarah arrived at Colonel Harrison's office with urgent news. She had spent half the night analyzing the conversation she had overheard between James and Linda, and the implications were more serious than either of them had initially understood. "Sir, I believe we're looking at a coordinated operation designed to gather intelligence about Exercise Thunderstrike specifically," Sarah reported. "The timing of everything suggests that the exercise is the primary target, not just an opportunity." Colonel Harrison's expression grew grave. Exercise Thunderstrike was a major multi-unit training operation that would involve testing new equipment and tactics. The information gathered during the exercise could provide valuable insights into American military capabilities and strategies. "How confident are you in this assessment?" he asked. "Very confident. The pattern of intelligence gathering has been building toward this for months, probably since before I started working here. The recent acceleration in activity coincides with the exercise planning timeline. Then we need to move quickly. The exercise begins in 4 days." Sarah had been thinking about this problem all night. "I have a proposal, but it's risky. We set a trap using the exercise itself as bait." Colonel Harrison listened as Sarah outlined her plan. Instead of trying to apprehend the suspects immediately, they would allow the intelligence operation to proceed while feeding it false information about the exercise. They would create fake plans, equipment lists, and tactical procedures that would appear genuine, but would actually lead any adversaries who acted on the information into a carefully prepared trap. "It's elegant," the colonel admitted, "but it requires us to let the suspects continue operating while we maintain control of what information they're able to steal. The risk is worth it if we can roll up the entire network instead of just the people we've identified. There are almost certainly other assets we haven't discovered yet." Colonel Harrison agreed to the plan, but insisted on additional security measures. Sarah would be equipped with monitoring devices and backup support in case the operation went wrong. They would also coordinate with federal agencies who had resources for dealing with foreign intelligence operations. The next 2 days were a whirlwind of preparation. Sarah worked with Colonel Harrison and a team of specialists to create comprehensive false documentation for Exercise Thunderstrike. They developed fake tactical plans, equipment specifications, and personnel assignments that would appear authentic to anyone who gained access to them. The challenge was ensuring that the real exercise information remained secure, while the false information was positioned where the suspects could access it. Sarah had to carefully orchestrate opportunities for each suspect to obtain pieces of the false intelligence without making it obvious that they were being fed information. James Peterson was given access to fake equipment manifests through his kitchen duties. When special meals were prepared for exercise planning meetings, Sarah made sure he could overhear conversations about the false tactical plans. She watched him carefully memorize details and make notes when he thought no one was looking. Linda Chen was provided with fake meal delivery schedules that included false information about when and where exercise activities would take place. Sarah also arranged for Linda to accidentally discover documents that contained false personnel assignments and communication protocols. Corporal Rodriguez was fed false inventory information through his official duties. But Sarah also made sure he overheard conversations about fake equipment requirements and storage locations. Throughout this process, Sarah maintained her cover as a kitchen worker, while simultaneously running one of the most complex intelligence operations of her career. The mental strain was enormous, but she felt more focused and capable than she had in years. On the evening before Exercise Thunderstrike was scheduled to begin, surveillance confirmed that information about the false plans had been transmitted to external parties. The trap was set, and now they would discover who was really behind the intelligence operation. Sarah barely slept that night, running through contingency plans and possible scenarios. She had arranged to take a sick day from kitchen duty so she could participate in the operational phase of their plan. For the first time since leaving the Rangers, She would be back in full operational mode. The next morning, Sarah met with Colonel Harrison and the federal agents who had joined the operation. They had established monitoring posts around the base and positioned response, teams near locations where the false intelligence suggested important activities would take place. Remember, the lead federal agent briefed the team. Our primary objective is to identify and apprehend the entire network. We want the people receiving the intelligence as much as we want the people stealing it. Sarah was assigned to monitor the base perimeter, where external surveillance had been detected in previous weeks. If foreign agents were planning to conduct reconnaissance based on the false information, this was where they would most likely appear. Positioned in a concealed observation post with high-tech surveillance equipment, Sarah felt a familiar rush of adrenaline. This was what she had trained for, what she was built for. The kitchen work had served its purpose, but this was who she really was. As the morning progressed, Sarah's surveillance detected unusual activity at multiple points around the base perimeter. Vehicles with sophisticated communication equipment were positioning themselves at locations that corresponded to the false information that had been leaked. The operation was working exactly as planned. "Control, this is Observation Post 3, Sarah reported over her radio. "I have visual confirmation of target vehicles at coordinates previously identified. They appear to be setting up surveillance equipment. Confirmed. OP3, maintain observation and report any changes." Sarah watched through her scope as figures moved around the vehicles, setting up what appeared to be long-range surveillance and communication equipment. These were clearly professionals with access to high-quality gear and training. At noon, the false exercise Thunderstrike was scheduled to begin according to the leaked information. Sarah observed increased activity from the surveillance teams as they prepared to monitor and record what they believed would be a major military training operation. "This is it," Sarah whispered into her radio. "They're fully committed to the false intelligence. All units, prepare for apprehension operations," came the response from the command post. As federal agents moved in to arrest the external surveillance teams, Sarah felt a sense of satisfaction and completion that she hadn't experienced since her military service. They had successfully identified and disrupted a foreign intelligence operation that could have compromised significant military information. But even as the arrests were being made, Sarah knew that this was just the beginning. The investigation would continue for months as authorities unraveled the full extent of the network and identified additional assets and handlers. More importantly for Sarah personally, the operation had shown her that she couldn't hide from who she really was forever. She was Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez, intelligence specialist, and no amount of kitchen work could change that fundamental truth about herself. As she packed up her surveillance equipment, Sarah realized that her quiet life was over. But instead of feeling sad about that loss, she felt excited about the possibilities that lay ahead. She had found her way back to herself, and she was ready for whatever challenges came next. 6 months later, Sarah stood in her new office overlooking the Fort Braxton training grounds. The nameplate on her door read, "Sarah Martinez, Security Consultant," and the office was filled with intelligence analysis equipment that would have been unimaginable during her kitchen days. The investigation that had started with a glimpse of her tattoo had led to the exposure of a major foreign intelligence network and had completely transformed her life. The arrests that day had been just the beginning. James Peterson, Linda Chen, and Corporal Rodriguez had all been charged with espionage and conspiracy. Under interrogation, they had revealed the existence of additional assets throughout the military and defense contractor community. The investigation had expanded to involve multiple federal agencies and had resulted in one of the largest counterintelligence operations in recent years. Sarah had played a crucial role in every phase of the investigation, from initial identification of suspects to analysis of the broader network. Her unique combination of military intelligence training and civilian cover had made her invaluable to the operation. When it was over, she had been offered positions with several federal agencies, but she had chosen to stay at Fort Braxton, working as a civilian security consultant with broad authority to assess and improve base operations. It allowed her to use her skills in a way that felt meaningful while maintaining the stability and routine that had helped her heal from her earlier military experiences. Colonel Harrison knocked on her office door and entered with a cup of coffee and a stack of reports. The monthly security assessment. "Is ready for your review," he said, setting the papers on her desk. "I think you'll be pleased with the improvements we've implemented." Sarah smiled as she looked through the reports. Fort Braxton now had one of the most sophisticated security programs in the military, with procedures and protocols that had been adopted by other installations around the country. The transformation had been dramatic and comprehensive. "Any word from the federal task force?" Colonel Harrison asked. "They've made 12 more arrests based on intelligence from our operation," Sarah replied. "The network was even larger than we initially suspected, with assets in defense contractors, government agencies, and military installations across 3 states. And you were the person who spotted the first thread that unraveled the whole thing." Sarah looked out the window at soldiers conducting training exercises on the grounds below. "I was just serving lunch in the mess hall," she said with a slight smile. "No, you weren't," Colonel Harrison replied firmly. "You were Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez, and you never stopped being that person even when you were trying to hide from it." The conversation was interrupted by Sarah's phone ringing. It was her sister Maria calling from California. "Hey, how's the new job going?" Maria asked when Sarah answered. "It's challenging and rewarding," Sarah replied. "I feel like I'm finally using my brain again. I'm so proud of you for making the change." "I always knew you were capable of more than serving food." Sarah laughed, thinking about how much her sister didn't know about what her food service job had really entailed. "Thanks, Maria. I'm proud of myself too." After the call, Sarah returned to reviewing the security reports, but her mind wandered to thoughts about how dramatically her life had changed. A year ago, she had been hiding from her past, trying to disappear into the routine of a simple job that required nothing of her beyond basic competence. Now she was leading security assessments, training other personnel in counterintelligence procedures, and consulting with federal agencies on matters of national security. The work was demanding and sometimes stressful, but it was also deeply satisfying in a way that kitchen work had never been. More importantly, she had learned that healing from trauma didn't require abandoning who she was at her core. The quiet years in the kitchen had served their purpose, giving her time to process her experiences and recover from her injuries. But ultimately, she was a soldier and an intelligence analyst. And those weren't just jobs she had once held. They were fundamental parts of her identity. Late that afternoon, Sarah walked through the mess hall where her new life had begun. Mrs. Patterson waved to her from behind the serving line, and several of the kitchen workers greeted her warmly. They all knew about her new position and were proud of her advancement, though they had no idea about the dramatic circumstances that had led to it. As Sarah watched the lunch service, she thought about the day Colonel Harrison had first noticed her tattoo. That moment had seemed like a disaster, an unwelcome exposure of a past she wanted to keep hidden. But it had actually been the beginning of her return to herself. The tattoo was still there on her arm, no longer hidden under long sleeves. It served as a reminder of her service and sacrifice, but also of her capabilities and potential. She had earned that marking through dedication, training, and courage, and she was no longer ashamed of what it represented. Walking back to her office, Sarah passed soldiers in training, officers planning operations, and civilian workers supporting the mission of the base. She was part of something important again, contributing her skills and experience to protect the people who served their country. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Colonel Harrison. New assignment came in from Pentagon. Interested in a consulting job at Fort Carson? They have security issues that need someone with your expertise. Sarah considered the message for a moment. Fort Carson would be a new challenge, a chance to apply what she had learned at Fort Braxton to a different installation with different problems. The work would be demanding and would require her to travel and adapt to new situations. But that was exactly what Staff Sergeant Sarah Martinez was trained to do. She typed back her response. "When do I start?" As the sun set over Fort Braxton, Sarah cleaned up her office and prepared to head home to her apartment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. To use her skills in service of something larger than herself, the quiet life she had built during her years in the kitchen would always be part of her story, a necessary chapter in her journey from trauma to recovery to renewal. But it was no longer the end of her story. It was the foundation for everything that came after. Sarah Martinez had served lunch in the mess hall until a colonel spotted her Special Forces tattoo. That moment of recognition had changed everything. not because it exposed her past, but because it reminded her of her future. She was no longer hiding from who she was. She was finally ready to be that person again. As she walked to her car, Sarah felt grateful for the winding path that had brought her to this point. Every experience, from her military service to her injury and recovery to her years in the kitchen, to her return to intelligence work, had been necessary to make her the person she was today. She was stronger than she had been before her injury, wiser than she had been during her first military service, and more complete than she had ever been. The tattoo on her arm was no longer a reminder of a life she had lost. It was a symbol of a life she had reclaimed,